there's such a variety of things that go into this social responsibility system that we would like to see, and of course a historical perspective is a very good one. And so our next speaker is Dr. Jack Cunningham, and he is a historian by all of his academic training, and his PhD in history is from the University of Toronto. And right now, as many of you know, I'm sure, because this is his sort of home, he's a program coordinator at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History in Trinity College in the Monk School. So, and he does book reviewing and teaching and research, and one of his interests is nuclear weapons and strategy. So let us welcome Jack Cunningham.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I don't want to add inaudibility to whatever other problems there may be with my remarks. Not only am I a graduate of the U of T's doctoral program, that's my doctoral director, a couple of seats down from me. So you can imagine what that's doing to my tension level. I just hope that he doesn't decide to revoke the PhD after I'm done. Now, since this is a generalist audience and I don't have a huge amount of time, I'm going to skimp on the arcana of nuclear strategy and the fine details of the relevant history, but I am going to talk about the significance of nuclear weapons during the Cold War in two contexts, that of deterrence and that of non-proliferation, and conclude with a few observations to guide us in our present circumstances. During the Cold War, nuclear arms were the most visible expression of the rivalry between the superpowers, but they were also, on occasion, the principal object of cooperation between them, although it was the rivalry that emerged first and that looms largest in our memories. And as an interesting test case where we see both dimensions on display, I would like to turn your attention for a moment to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which was mentioned earlier today. Now, that crisis is important historically, not only because it brought the world so close to the edge of nuclear war, but because its resolution depended on tacit superpower cooperation on matters nuclear. You know, at the height of that crisis, Fidel Castro urged Nikita Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. This obviously alarmed the Soviet leader, and it made him more thankful than ever before that he'd kept the Soviet missiles under Soviet control. And in the resolution of the crisis, Khrushchev had to press Castro to acquiesce without too much complaint in the withdrawal of the missiles, and to permit the aerial reconnaissance required to verify it, and to provide the necessary quid pro quo for the settlement. President Kennedy had to lean on Turkey to discreetly accept the removal of obsolete Jupiter missiles. Now, not everyone applauded the resolution of the crisis. There were official Chinese statements that chastised Khrushchev for cowardice in backing down rather than accepting the risks of nuclear war. We do see overt and formal superpower cooperation on non-proliferation in the strict sense a little later, with the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which obliged signatories to refrain from most forms of the testing essential to the development of nuclear forces, and then the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why the concern with proliferation? Well, in part because the Cuban crisis had helped dramatize the capacity of third parties to create or exacerbate nuclear crises, a problem that would be worsened if it was perceived if any of them acquired nuclear weapons themselves. Now, some of this had to do with the technical characteristics of new nuclear forces. Joe Nye of the Kennedy School has referred to what he calls a valley of vulnerability through which new nuclear forces inevitably pass, when they're small and vulnerable, when they invite preemptive attack by local rivals, and are useful only if launched before an anticipated attack. They're also likely to have poor command and control arrangements, and thus to be more vulnerable to unauthorized or accidental launch. But the concern with proliferation also had to do with geopolitics and its contours. As Francis Gavin writes, in the early 1960s, the existing nuclear powers were fundamentally status quo powers. But some of the potential nuclear proliferators had unsettled or disputed borders, like Germany, were viewed with suspicion by their neighbors because of their history of wartime aggression, Germany again, Japan, or the regime was seen to contemplate nuclear war with a disturbing equanimity, China during the Cuban crisis, later North Korea. And the superpowers discouraged proliferation through various means. They pressed potential proliferators to sign the relevant treaties, for example, pressing the two Germanys to sign both the Test Ban Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They denied nuclear assistance. The Soviets tried to stop China from developing a bomb by withholding aid, and eventually both the Soviets and the Chinese withheld aid to North Korea's nuclear program. In fact, at one point, Washington and Moscow were so alarmed at the possibility of a Chinese nuclear capability, there were even tentative conversations about joint military action to take out Chinese nuclear facilities. And then there was extended deterrence. The United States extended its own nuclear umbrella to cover those who might otherwise be tempted to acquire nuclear capabilities of their own and help fuel destabilizing local nuclear arms races, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. So we had efforts to dampen proliferation at the level of local potential conflicts, where nuclear weapons were seen as profoundly destabilizing, all within the framework of a relatively stable global balance at the level of the larger superpower rivalry underpinned by deterrence. In the core theater of that rivalry, Europe, it was not only nuclear war that didn't take place, but conventional hostilities, because the risk of escalation to all-out war inhibited aggression that was more likely to have taken place in a non-nuclear world. Now, when deterrence works, war is averted, which puts the historian, like me, in the somewhat difficult position of trying to explain why something didn't happen. Fortunately, we do have a rich documentary record of the major crises of the Cold War. I don't have time to summarize the evidence here, but I would direct you to the volumes of the Foreign Relations series on the Berlin and Cuba crises, and to a lesser extent on the Soviet side in the volumes of documents published by the Cold War International History Project. These reveal the pervasiveness and the constraining effect on decision makers of the fear that any East-West clash would escalate to all-out nuclear hostilities, which makes, I would argue, the workings of deterrence the most parsimonious explanation for the fact that war did not materialize, even over the egregious anomaly of a West Berlin surrounded by East Germany, though, to be sure, we came uncomfortably close on a few occasions. The superpower nuclear arsenals were mentioned in the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, which postulated something of a bargain. Non-nuclear states would refrain from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons, and the existing nuclear signatories would pursue nuclear disarmament. Now, during the Cold War, as well as after, the nuclear powers were often criticized by potential proliferators for not upholding their end of the alleged bargain, which, it was claimed, rendered hypocritical their demands that others show restraint. But the logic was specious and the claims often self-serving, because the failures of the existing nuclear powers to reduce their arsenals really didn't have a lot to do with why some states sought nukes and others did not. Despite the growth of superpower nuclear forces in the 1970s and 80s, we did not see the predicted addition of dozens of nuclear powers. Why? Well, a number of potential proliferators faltered in the face of economic or technological challenges, or they concluded that going nuclear would make them less rather than more secure, since they could develop only vulnerable forces that would invite preemption. And of course, others abstained because they were reassured by the extension of the American umbrella. Those who did go nuclear did so not merely because they were goaded by the example of the nuclear powers into mindless emulation, but for relatively rational reasons rooted in relatively rational calculations of national interest. China sought to strengthen its bid for leadership within the communist camp. India sought to strengthen its claim to leadership in the developing world and to deter Chinese aggression. As for the undeclared nuclear power of Israel, after 1973, its neighbors gave up on large-scale conventional attack to destroy it. I find it easier to believe that this was rooted in the recognition Israel had a nuclear capability, undeclared but widely known, than that an epidemic of sanity suddenly swept the leadership of the Arab world. And even now, disarmament by the established nuclear powers won't remove the genuine clashes of interest that lead others to seek nuclear weapons. How to deal with proliferation in the post-Cold War world? That, I suppose, is the immediate question. And the options include two that, to my mind, are equally unrealistic. One school of thought, associated with Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer, holds that possession of nuclear weapons makes a regime more responsible as an international actor, and that the more states that have them, the more stable the globe. The other school contends that the weapons are so corrupt and corrupting that he who has them has touched pitch and is forever defiled, so we must get rid of them all. Both schools fall prey to the same logical fallacy. As Joe Nye has written, it is tempting to reason from an equal right of self-defense to the proposition that all states, or none, should have nuclear weapons. But to think that way, you have to ignore historical context and probable consequences. If you think of those, you're more likely to accept the case for unequal possession of the weapons. The moral status of any weapon is a function of its destructiveness and the likelihood of its being used to kill or destroy. The moral status of nuclear weapons and of deterrence relying upon them is contextual. The working of the deterrent effect is probabilistic. It's a calculation of risks, and in some circumstances, the gamble is simply better than in others. As John Gaddis points out, the Cold War superpowers were relatively satisfied when they acquired nuclear weapons. They were separated by oceans and continents. They were not heavily dependent on each other economically. They were not directly in competition for possession of the same territory. And the bipolar system did not require the sophistication of a Metternich or Bismarck to operate, and it featured well-defined, stable spheres of influence. The deterrent effect of nuclear weapons does not operate, or for that matter, fail to operate, in isolation. Circumstances can reinforce or undercut it. And under the circumstances just described, the likelihood of its working was relatively high. But still, there were near misses, occasions when the resort to nuclear weapons was seriously contemplated, or when glitches in command and control arrangements nudged us towards accidental war. Where conditions like these are absent, deterrence becomes a less promising gamble. And of course, the nature of the regime matters. It's tempting to believe that awareness of the destructiveness of nuclear weapons sobers all. But I would argue that wager is a very risky one indeed in the case of those whose rationality is legitimately at issue from their own actions and statements. The crazed theocrats who contend for power in Iran, or the dynasty of lunatics that has ruled North Korea. And even where stable deterrence is theoretically possible, getting there can be tricky. Remember the valley of vulnerability. So nuclear weapons are riskier in the case of new nuclear powers, all other things being equal. In contemplating the temptation of abolition, we should recall the wisdom of the philosopher Bernard Williams. People talk as though giving up nuclear weapons would mean that they no longer existed, but that is a dangerous illusion. You would not go back to a situation before nuclear weapons were invented. You would rather get a situation in which nuclear weapons were always just about to be invented. This is because the knowledge required to build the weapons cannot be unlearned. So in that sense, the belief in a truly post-nuclear world is an exercise in denial, akin to acceptance of creationism or disbelief in anthropogenic climate change. In fact, the barriers to development of nuclear weapons are in important respects lower than they were just a few years ago. The needed information is in the public domain. It's easy to steal fissile material or buy it on the black market. And you can get very far down the road to a nuclear capability without detection, barring inspection regimes so intrusive, few states would willingly accept them. Moreover, if nuclear weapons ever were temporarily eliminated, their inevitable reintroduction would likely come in an international crisis, a crisis it would exacerbate if it already existed or create if it did not. And those hazards would be grafted on to the technical risks posed by the valley of vulnerability. This is not a scenario conducive to the calm operation of deterrence. Indeed, even the declared pursuit of abolition as policy has its perils. President Obama's endorsement of the goal of global zero has fueled doubts about the reliability of the American umbrella, and thus discussion of developing homegrown nuclear capabilities in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey. The replacement of the equilibrium provided by extended deterrence with local nuclear arms races is likely to be considerably worse for global stability. I'm not being altogether facetious when I suggest that the only plausible answer to the question, do nuclear weapons aid or undermine geopolitical stability, is yes. Now, accepting them where they aid stability and trying to prevent them where they do not is perhaps a less inspiring cause than their elimination, but the latter makes the perfect the enemy of the good. As for the nuclear inequality selective non-proliferation entails, the beginning of political maturity is the recognition that there are inequities that cannot be rectified at a tolerable price. Now, the destructiveness of nuclear weapons means that their possession can never be more than a necessary evil, and thus deterrence, as Nye writes, can never be more than conditionally moral. But for even that to hold, we must act to minimize the risks that accompany the possession of these weapons and reduce our reliance on them over time to the extent we prudently can. Fortunately, we have a lot of room to do so. Professor Nichols' recent book is one of the better blueprints for going about it. But we should recognize that beyond a certain point, this not only will have diminishing returns, but will actually be counterproductive for global security. Kennedy and Khrushchev were right 50 years ago when they concluded not all nuclear weapons were equal in their implications for geopolitics, and the wisdom of that recognition is still relevant today. Thank you.